Hello Braille class, today we're going to be reading another part of Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. Remember, in yesterday's part of the story, the Knids were attacking the capsule and the president had lost radio with the astronauts on the capsule. Shanks, cried the president. Where are you, Shanks? Shugworth? Shanks? Showler? Shalworth? Shugs? Shankler? Shankworth? Shugler? Why don't you answer me? Up in the Great Glass Elevator, where they had no radio and could hear nothing of these conversations, Charlie was saying, surely their only hope is to make a re-entry and dive back to Earth quickly. Yes, said Mr. Wonka, but in order to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, they've got to kick themselves out of orbit. They've got to change course and head downwards, and to do that they need rockets. But their rocket tubes are all dented and bent. You can see that from here. They're crippled. Why can't we tow them down? Charlie asked. Mr. Wonka jumped. Even though he was floating, he somehow jumped. He was so excited he shot upwards and hit his head on the ceiling. Then he spun round 3 times in the air and cried, Charlie, you've got it! That's it! We'll tow them out of orbit. To the buttons, quick! What do we tow them with? Asked Grandpa Joe. Our neckties? Don't you worry about a little thing like that, cried Mr. Wonka. My Great Glass Elevator is ready for anything. In we go, into the breach, dear friends, into the breach. Stop him! Screamed Grandma Josephine. You be quiet, Josie, said Grandpa Joe. There's someone over there that needs a helping hand and it's our job to give it. If you're frightened, you better just close your eyes tight and stick your fingers in your ears. You can see here the picture of Willy Wonka jumping in the air. Chapter 11, The Battle of the Knids. Grandpa Joe, sir, shouted Mr. Wonka, kindly jet yourself over to the far corner of the elevator there and turn that handle. It lowers the rope. A rope's no good, Mr. Wonka. The Knids will bite through a rope in 1 second. It's a steel rope, said Mr. Wonka. It's made of re-scorched steel. If they try to bite through that, their teeth will splinter like spillikins. To your buttons, Charlie. You've got to help me manoeuvre. We're going right over the top of the transport capsule and then we'll try to hook onto it somewhere and get a firm hold. Like a battleship going into action, the Great Glass Elevator with booster rockets firing moved smoothly in over the top of the enormous transport capsule. The Knids immediately stopped attacking the capsule and went for the elevator. Squadron after squadron of giant vermicious Knids flung themselves furiously against Mr. Wonka's marvellous machine. Wham! Crash! Bang! The noise was thunderous and terrible. The elevator was tossed about the sky like a leaf, and inside it, Grandma Josephine, Grandma Georgina and Grandpa George, floating in their nightshirts, were all yowling and screeching and flapping their arms and calling for help. Mrs. Bucket had wrapped her arms around Mr. Bucket and was clasping him so tightly that one of his shirt buttons punctured his skin. Charlie and Mr. Wonka, as cool as 2 cubes of ice, were up near the ceiling working the booster rocket controls, and Grandpa Joe, shouting war cries and throwing curses at the Knids, was down below turning the handle that unwound the steel rope. At the same time, he was watching the rope through the glass floor of the elevator. Starboard a bit, Charlie, shouted Grandpa Joe. We're right on top of her now. Forward a couple of yards, Mr. Wonka. I'm trying to get the hook hooked around that stumpy thing sticking out in front of there. Hold it. I've got it. That's it. Forward a little now and see if it holds. More. The big steel rope tightened. It held. And now, wonder of wonders, with our booster rockets blazing, the elevator began to tow the huge transport capsule forward and away. Full speed ahead, shouted Grandpa Joe. She's going to hold. She's holding. She's holding fine. All boosters firing, cried Mr. Wonka, and the elevator leaped ahead. Still the rope held. Mr. Wonka jetted himself down to Grandpa Joe and shook him warmly by the hand. Well done, sir, he said. You did a brilliant job under heavy fire. Charlie looked back at the transport capsule some 30 yards behind them on the end of the tow line. It had little windows up front, and in the windows he could clearly see the flabbergasted faces of Shugworth, Shanks and Showler. When you're flabbergasted, that means like you're really, really, really like shocked and surprised, like your mouth's open like... Charlie waved to them and gave them the thumbs up signal. They didn't wave back. They simply gaped. They couldn't believe what was happening. Grandpa Joe blew himself upward and hovered beside Charlie, bubbling with excitement. Charlie, my boy, he said, we've been through a few funny things together lately, but never anything like this. Grandpa, where are the Knids? They've suddenly vanished. Everyone looked round. The only Kinid in sight was their old friend with the purple behind, still cruising alongside in its usual place, still glaring into the elevator. "Just a minute," cried Grandma Josephine. "What's that I see over there?" Again they looked, and this time, sure enough, away in the distance, in the deep blue sky of outer space, they saw a massive cloud of vermicious Kinids wheeling and circling like a fleet of bombers. "If you think we're out of the woods yet, you're crazy," shouted Grandma Georgina. "I fear no Kinids," said Mr. Wonka. "We've got them beaten now." "Poppy rot and pig wash," said Grandma Josephine. "Any moment now they'll be at us again. Look at them. They're coming in. They're coming closer." This was true. The huge fleet of Kinids had moved in an incredible speed and was now flying level with the great glass elevator, a couple of 100 yards away on their right-hand side. The one with the bump on its rear end was much closer, only 20 yards away on the same side. "It's changing shape," cried Charlie. "That nearest one, what's it going to do? It's getting longer and longer." And indeed it was. The mammoth egg-shaped body was slowly stretching itself out like chewing gum, becoming longer and longer and thinner, until in the end it looked exactly like a long, slimy green serpent, as thick as a thick tree and as long as a football pitch. At the front end were the eyes, big and white with red centres. At the back, a kind of tapering tail, and at the very end of the tail was the enormous round swollen bump it had got when it crashed against the glass. The people floating inside the elevator watched and waited. Then they saw the long rope-like Kinid turning and coming straight, but quite slowly, towards the great glass elevator. Now it began actually wrapping its ropey body around the elevator itself. Once around it went, then twice around, and very horrifying it was to be inside and to see the soft green body squishing against the outside of the glass no more than a few inches away. "It's tying us up like a parcel," yelled Grandma Josephine. "Buncombe," said Mr. Wonka. "It's going to crush us in its coils," wailed Grandma Georgina. "Never," said Mr. Wonka. Charlie glanced quickly back at the transport capsule. The sheet-white faces of Shookworth, Shanks and Showler were pressed against the glass of the little windows, terror-struck, stupefied, stunned, their mouths open, their expressions frozen like fish fingers. Once again, Charlie gave them the thumbs-up signal. Showler acknowledged it with a sickly grin, but that was all. "Oh, oh, oh!" screamed Grandma Josephine. "Get that beastly squishy thing away from here!" Having curled its body twice around the elevator, the Kinid now proceeded to tie a knot with its two ends. A good strong knot, left over right, then right over left. When it had pulled the knot tight, there remained about 5 yards of one end hanging loose. This was the end with the eyes on it, but it didn't hang loose for long. It quickly curled itself into the shape of a huge hook, and the hook stuck straight out sideways from the elevator, as though waiting for something else to hook itself onto it. While all this was going on, nobody had noticed what the other Kinids were up to. "Mr. Wonka," Charlie cried, "look at the others! What are they doing?" What indeed? These too had all changed shape and had become longer, but not nearly so long or so thin as the first one. Each of them had turned itself into a kind of thick rod, and the rod was curled around at both ends, at the tail end and at the head end, so that it made a double-ended hook. And now all the hooks were linking up into one long chain. 1,000 Kinids, all joining together and curving around in the sky to make a chain of Kinids half a mile long or more. And the Kinid at the very front of the chain, whose front hook was not, of course, hooked up to anything, was leading them in a wide circle and sweeping in towards the great glass elevator. And I'll show you the picture there so you can see the big one that's hooked around the great glass elevator, and then you can see all the Kinids changing shape and linking up. "Hey!" shouted Grandpa Joe. "They're going to hook us up with this brute who's tied himself around us and tow us away," cried Charlie. "To the planet Vermes," gasped Grandma Josephine. 18,427 million miles from here. "They can't do that," cried Mr. Wonka. "We're doing the towing around here." "They're going to link up, Mr. Wonka," Charlie said. "They really are. Can't we stop them? They're going to tow us away, and they're going to tow the people we're towing away as well." "Do something, you old fool," shrieked Grandma Georgina. "Don't just float about looking at them." "I must admit," said Mr. Wonka, "that for the first time in my life I find myself at a bit of a loss." They all stared in horror through the glass at the long chain of vermicious Kinids. The leader of the chain was coming closer and closer. The hook, with two big, angry eyes in it, was out and ready. In 30 seconds, it would link up with the hook of the knid wrapped around the elevator. I want to go home, wailed Grandma Josephine. Why can't we all go home? Great thundering tomcats, cried Mr. Unger. Home is right. What on earth am I thinking of? Come on, Charlie. Quick. Re-entry. You take the yellow button. Press it for all you're worth. I'll handle this lot. Charlie and Mr. Wonka literally flew to the buttons. Hold your hats, shouted Mr. Unger. Grab your gizzards. We're going down. I hope you enjoyed that part of the story.